see any sort of indelible changes in healthcare? The thing that I've been thinking about lately is, as you know, wartime has generally led to some pretty significant innovations in the treatment of trauma. And I think a lot of the trauma system that we have now came out of the World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. You know, for instance, the use of helicopters to retrieve patients from a distance and bring them to a center of excellence. So do you see, as somebody who thinks about systems and systematic change, do you see any sort of something with staying power here affecting how healthcare is delivered or even paid for?
So Peter, you're spot on when you talk about war. You know, when I was originally in training back in the 60s, Vietnam fundamentally changed how we handle burns. Burns were a big deal. Edwards Air Force Base and what we learned from burns fundamentally changed the nature of our practice moving forward. Just served on a big National Academy of Medicine committee a year or two ago. The big change out of 13 continuous years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's tourniquets and bleeding control and a triage system associated with that. Wow, they learned a lot, did a lot. Now, interestingly, one of the things that came from that committee, as soon as the war ended, we fell off the track. We retained the medical knowledge about burns and continued to advance it at admittedly a slower rate, but it continued to advance. We'll retain about trauma management, particularly blood bleeding control early on, and better triage systems. We'll retain that. The rate of innovation dropped back off though, and keeping fairly close track with the military health system. I believe that probably that's already happening. What are some of the big things that will change within healthcare delivery? So two pieces. I'm at least thinking I'm seeing some fundamental change in the medical model for acute respiratory distress syndrome. I think that COVID has advanced our science around that, and that'll definitely stick in the long haul. And you realize ARDS is not just a disease associated with COVID, but a lot of other conditions. Well, it was defined back in the 60s, and I think we'll see a bit of a breakthrough in our understanding, our science, our treatment of respiratory distress syndrome. In terms of the health system as a whole, I've been tracking closely for some years. I believe that pay for value is growing rapidly. I have a series of what I call forward-looking indicators. Now, it's not widely appreciated, best I can hear. When you talk to people, they're still fairly skeptical about how it's going, but my indicators are showing this really solid growth. Part of COVID, for example, if you were a primary care practice that was largely capitated or had some sort of a shared risk model, those practices did very well. Under COVID, they thrived. On the other hand, traditional fee-for-service primary care practice, a lot of those people were facing business failure, complete collapse, you see. It's driving many of those practices to associate with larger organizations, to move into employment relationships. It's an ongoing push toward the death of independent primary care, but it's also a push where we're seeing the financial model shift. And if anything, COVID is accelerating the shift into provider at risk, pay for value, population health, all names for the same thing. I think that that's a really good thing for healthcare delivery and for the healing professions, which is a longer story, but I personally think that's exactly where we need to move. And I think that it's going to, the change was already underway, it's going to accelerate it. And on this one, I don't think there's any moving back. I think this one, it just accelerates that shift. So you better be ready. It's coming to your town, to your office, and you better be ready if you're not already.
I've heard people say that for quite a few years. Do you think you'll see a shift to value-based care, capitated models, whatever label you want to put on it, in specialty
Ooh,
medicine, because some of those, cardiologists, for instance, I think saw sort of a
yeah.
disappearance of revenue and whatnot. Now, I presume that they're sort of protected in various ways, maybe by being paid handsomely to begin with. But uh, I've wondered when primary care seems vulnerable to this trend, but I'm wondering about other aspects of healthcare.
Yeah. It's interesting. Specialty care is one you've hit on it. It's one of the dicier areas. It's not as clear how it will play out. I don't have a really good feel for how it will play out. There are two main paths it could take. So I've seen some specialty groups who are actually taking risk around a specific disease entity, and they're doing really well with it. They're really good at what they do. They're delivering absolute top end care. They're delivering it very efficiently, and they're taking advantage of that high value in the marketplace, you see. Those groups are relatively rare.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't see an awful lot of them. When you see them, holy cow, it's pretty. I mean, it's professionally satisfying. From a business standpoint, it's sweet. You really like it. But it takes real leadership to make that happen. Maybe some special circumstances, a little bit of luck too. On the other hand, what happens as this occurs, the demand for specialty care probably drops a bit, believe it or not. And with that drop, it forces most specialty practices into the role, it's called price takers, where competition now starts to take place more at the level of pure price. And it's all efficiency of operations. Everybody just assumes it's a given you're required to maintain a certain level of quality as best they can perceive it.
Right.
You see. So I see both those strategies. You can obviously tell which one I prefer. I'd rather create my own future than let it happen to me. And
Right.
not only that, when I create that future, it's the right future for the patients and for the profession, and I guess, frankly, down the list of it, for the industry. So I like that one, but those seem to be the two choices I see out there. What else do you think would happen with that? That's unfair to kick it back on the interviewer, but why not? You're an expert on this too.
No, I'm not. I just I play one on TV.
Yeah, it's more interesting. Hospitalization rates are going to drop, and we'll probably have a fair bit of overbuilt capacity on the hospital sides. The question is how much can population growth, demographic shifts of the baby boomers going into the chronic disease years, of course, that's going to drive up need for care and new technologies. Those are countervailing forces, and how fast will the demand for hospitalization drop versus growth in those other demands. At the moment, though, if it were me and I were running the system, I would not be building more hospital beds.
Yeah, and I think you've actually had some work done out at Utah, Hospital at Home. University of Utah has a Hospital at Home program that I've heard and done some interviews about. And so, some of that intense care that you used to think had to take place in the hospital, maybe parts of it, not all of it, it sort of depends on where you are, could be delivered in people's homes. Healthcare is very capital intensive, and I'm in Philly, so we have Penn, which is this sort of mini city, and I was in Boston, and if you're in the Longwood area, it's a mini city, and I've wondered about the future of these crowded, busy urban places, and whether COVID might disrupt those. Maybe sort of a bit of a lightning round, because we should wrap this up pretty soon. So, telehealth, big deal, real deal?
So telehealth actually falls into two categories. One is doctor to patient. That's got a lot of emphasis during this. The trouble is it's only at maximum 10% of the total market. The far more interesting play in telehealth is professional to professional. Now, oftentimes it's a patient at one end of the line, but they have a professional sitting with them. But this is EICU, e-pharmacy, EED, but also if you really want to see a fun program, look at what they're running up at the University of Utah in terms of outreach to rural communities with specialty clinics, where you have a physician or a nurse practitioner out in the rural community sitting with the patient and the specialist here in Salt Lake City. That is pretty. That's Dr. Terry Box is leading that, and that has some real potential. So I tend to divide telehealth into two chunks, and all the emphasis has been on the, doc to patient.
Yep.
It's such a small part of the whole market. I think that will have a limited long-term impact, probably. The stuff, though, that's happening clinician to clinician with the patient part of the conversation, that one is interesting. That's one to really take a look at. The reason is it affects so much more of the healthcare dollar.
Right. And what about your life's work in looking at healthcare as in a systematic way, looking at outcomes, data? I'm getting peppered every day by some vendor that's promising that COVID is going to usher in an era of artificial intelligence and really wonderful, dazzling use of data. Do you see it as an accelerant in that area, or are people just selling their wares at the healthcare bazaar?
So this is just an opinion. I hope I'm wrong. Now the truth is the truth in advertising part. My work at the Clinical Excellence Research Center at Stanford, we're way into the whole artificial intelligence approach, machine learning approach. So we're very interested in it. Relative to COVID changing the rate of change, accelerating it, I'm a little bit skeptical that it will. On the other hand, they are correct that is an area of major growth going forward. It was growing already. It will continue to grow. It's very important. I just don't think that COVID by its nature will accelerate it beyond what it was. So we won't use COVID for excuse. It's worthy in its own right, all right, independent of COVID. And so it's still a good topic. I think that it takes longer than we have, but I think that that's going to be one of the real sea changers. If we can change the way that we share information with clinical teams and the patients they serve, most patients get their data in the context of a conversation with a clinician. And twice at IOM, now National Academy of Medicine, we studied that. And that's true meaning of transparency. And it turns out our transparency levels are lower than they ought to be. They could be much higher. But it requires a broader definition of how we modify data systems for transparency on a broad scale. And that one is a very, very high leverage area. If we can make changes there, it will fundamentally shift care. It'll make us all better doctors and better nurses.